ICCM presents Good Intentions, a conversation about ethics in community music, social justice work and wider activism. Just to say lovely to see you all and to welcome our fabulous Diljeet. Diljeet is a Scottish Indian musician, educator, researcher and activist based in Glasgow, Scotland. And she completed her PhD with the University of Edinburgh in 2019 and since then has gone on to do many wonderful and impactful things that I'm sure Diljeet will discuss with you today. One final thing I want to mention is that Diljeet and I first met at an ICCM student symposium, an in-person event at York St John University. Was it back in 2017 or 2016, Diljeet? And Diljeet presented her work at this event, and actually we'd started a bit of remote joining. We'd had some people from Wilfrid Laurier University Skyping in and giving their paper presentations that way. And I just remember so vividly meeting you for the first time, Diljeet, and hearing about your starting PhD at that student symposium and enjoying that lovely massive cake together. It was, a few smiles, people that were there. It was so great, and it's been lovely to continue to kind of catch up with you on our kind of research journeys and for you to be joining us today and presenting on this theme of community music and ethics. So I'll hand over to you, Diljeet. Welcome, and thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Jo. And before I get into things, I just want to say thanks for having me. It's really nice. It feels like I'm kind of coming full circle, coming back to ICCM on the other side of a PhD, because I was very much in the middle of it all when we all met, and it's nice to see so many familiar faces and names on the call. So as Jo said, I'm going to be talking today about some of the ethical questions that have come up in my mind kind of through the PhD and on the other side of it. Oh, sorry, there goes my door. I will see if someone else will answer it. So the title of my talk is Good Intentions. And really, these are questions that have come out of, just wider thinking. As Jo said, I do lots of different work, lots of activism in different spheres, including trade union movement. And so this is me really bringing in questions and kind of joining a lot of dots in my work that I do across my teaching, work I'm doing in community music and wider equalities-driven activism work and social justice work. So what I'll do is I'll give a little bit of an overview of my starting point for all of this, which of course was the PhD, which has been on many twisting and turning journeys. And so hopefully even for those who've heard bits of it before when it was a work in progress, there'll still be some new bits and pieces in this today. I want to contextualise a lot of my questions through what the world kind of witnessed and went through last year, because that for me has raised a lot of ethical questions about how we engage in activism, and then bringing that back to bring those questions into more of a community music context and looking at the impact of them. So starting point for all of this, of course, being my PhD, which now has a title. I don't think it did when it was last at ICCM, and that is Facilitating Musical Learning in Scottish Primary Schools, an interview-based study of generalist primary teachers, primary music specialists and community music practitioners' views and experiences. And it'll become clear why I looked at those three groups of workers. So how I got into that was really from being involved in community music before my PhD for long enough to be asked to lead a workshop. And that was faith being put in me by the organisation I was working with, but I felt that I had no training and I didn't have the self-belief that I could facilitate a workshop. And on asking if I could engage with in training, I was told by that organisation, actually, we know you well enough and we think you have witnessed everything you need to witness about our way of working, that you have participated in that way of working enough so that we think you could lead a workshop and do it well. And so this left me asking lots of questions that then became my PhD about a year into it, much to my supervisor's frustration that I changed my project. But I just couldn't let go of this question of, well, what does it actually take to make someone a good inclusive facilitator of musical learning? What do you need to have in your possession in order to facilitate workshops? Do you have to have training or qualifications? What about your personality, your personal qualities, your social skills and social personal qualities? And if it's not about your qualifications, and if it is more about your skills, qualities, characteristics, and your experiences, what does that mean for who can teach music or facilitate musical learning or musical experiences that might unintentionally lead to learning, as is often the case, I think, in community music? So the context for looking at community music and primary music together was from looking at musical ability and identity beliefs and kind of contextualizing that in a music education that has historically excluded people in the UK, and that notions of musical ability and identity and these sort of exclusive practices both present barriers to participation in music. And from my initial experiences of community music, and also from reading work like Jenny Henley's work around teachers' experiences of music, I really had broadened out my own understanding of what it might mean to be musical, and that being part of community music had really broadened that, really took me beyond participation, active engagement, to things like listening to music, and as Jenny puts it, sort of feeling musical. And I felt that if community music was to share some of those broader conceptions with schools and formal education, that it might broaden ideas of what it might mean for teachers, for people who don't necessarily feel musical, to adopt a musical identity. Simultaneously, in Scotland, the Curriculum for Excellence, which has been around for about a decade now, has always described schools and classrooms as communities, as places for learning as a community. And this isn't a new idea. Estelle Jorgensen has described music education as a community back in the 90s. And so I wanted to explore how those broader concepts might allow, the broader concepts of musical ability, identity, might allow generalist teachers to frame their experiences of feelings towards and beliefs about music education in a more open way that might allow them to develop confidence. And we know that that's a long-standing issue around provision, that in primary schools, generalist teachers often don't feel that they have, much like I didn't feel like I had it in a community music context, but had someone telling me I could. These teachers just don't have that self-belief that they can do it. So my PhD research questions were really about understanding what the generalist primary teachers' experiences of attitudes, beliefs and feelings about music education in their own lives and their teaching practice were, and simultaneously for community music practitioners, how their lives and their feelings and experiences fed into their professional practice, and again, same with primary music specialists, and really comparing how these different groups of individuals perceived being musical and perceived their role and job of teaching and facilitating music, and what they felt and what their thoughts were on who could do it, and what were the issues that they faced. And looking at those three groups of people who all work in similar contexts and in many ways overlapping in the same contexts, what could they learn from each other's views? And I did that through individual interviews with about 30, so 10 of each, 10 generalists, 10 community practitioners, and 10 primary music specialists. So jumping fast forward a little bit to my findings, and these are things that I'm sure to many of us in the field are not revolutionary. We know these things, but certainly they came through in the research, was that community music and teaching careers sometimes just happen. And this was something I expected to find, having read Stephanie Pitt's book, Chances and Choices, kind of the idea of drifting into work. I know that I've done it. I drifted into community music. It just happened, and it changed my life. And I know many other people for whom that happened. But also I found that, especially for younger practitioners, newer into the field out of their courses of study, financial need was a huge motivator. So actually a lot with teachers, there was a sense of teaching as a stable job. So there was a motivation of job security in terms of financial need, but also for musicians, many music graduates looking to teaching or community music as a way of earning money as new graduates. And in both cases, for teachers and community practitioners, they both expressed a lot of views around what they felt their formal education had actually done for them in terms of preparing them for the workforce, and felt that most of the learning happened on the job, which of course presents all sorts of potential issues. So in their words, they felt that there were unintentional trajectories. So a common thing I think for musicians is, you know, we immerse ourselves in our practice, we find ourselves at the point of transitioning between secondary and tertiary education, that music is the option. And then within that, so for example here, when I decided I didn't want to play, well, what else was there? It was that, and I had an opportunity. But I look back on it now and I think I had no idea what I was doing, none at all. So kind of through a perceived lack of choices, someone went into becoming a specialist primary teacher. And at the initial point of entering that, they didn't know what they were doing. So they unintentionally went into teaching without training, without a sense of feeling like they could do the job. But they didn't feel like they had much other choice in terms of their skill sets. Similarly, motivation through financial need, many specialists and community musicians needed a job. The specialist says, I needed a job, I needed money, and if I could earn that in a musical way, all the better. A community musician said to me, the day I graduated, I put an ad on one of these Gumtree things or whatever, because I had a flat to pay for, and I was like singing lessons at my flat. So again, this sort of foray into the unregulated world of private music tuition. And very much in terms of the work, the learning happening on the job, it was described to me in ways that felt very sink or swim. You know, so generalist teacher saying to me, you've got maybe a few lessons showing you how to work with kids, and then bang, you were into it on placement or into it on just in your actual teaching. You know, so either during that school year or on your first job appointment after graduating, and a sense that there was some but a limited amount of actual teaching in that training, but actually that the learning, you just had to go in kind of like a baptism of fire, sink or swim, and just work it out. And in terms of, in particular, the community music workforce, in terms of really highlighting the unregulated nature of things, certainly at the time at which the people I spoke to had entered the workforce, you know, they were being contacted in this case. So someone says, I left university and they contacted me and said, would you like to run this little project with children with complex needs? You know, and what is it very much, their experience of that was that there wasn't a huge amount of checking. It was, you're a graduate, therefore you're qualified, therefore come and do it. And I know that experience. I've had, my mum worked in a nursery and would always say, why don't you come and do some music for the nursery? And I'm like, Mum, I'm not an early music specialist. I'm not an early years music specialist. I can't do that. And also questions around people's experiences of community music training. We never talked about ethics in my memory. And if we did, it was once. And it felt like we were unprepared a lot of the time. So really beginning to think about the responsibility of the higher education provider. And then this quote has always stuck with me. I haven't got a clue what I'm doing, but my degree says I've got a 2-1 in community music. So what does that mean? Again, it links back to that first quote on the page there. What happens when we have a degree that says we do something? And how does that relate to our actual sort of self-perception of what we can do? So fast forwarding a little bit, those were some of the kind of thoughts and questions and issues that arose out of the PhD. And of course, I finished that in 2019 and it kind of sat on it for a little while. I'm finally emerging from that sort of cave and starting to think about it again, having processed it all. Last year, obviously, was unlike anything I think we've experienced in our lifetimes. So my questions around that really stem from trying to understand why the world is suddenly paying attention to a lot of issues around inclusion, equality, diversity, access, justice. And of course, if we look back into 2020, not only have we had the coronavirus pandemic, but in particular in the spring, summer of last year, the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd in the US, that shook the world in a way that I think certainly for me within communities of people of colour, there had been outrage and there had been visible efforts to raise awareness. But it felt with 2020 that those particular instances of police violence made more people pay attention and really made the Black Lives Matter movement more visible than I felt I'd seen it. And that's a movement that we're talking about having existed since the murder of Trayvon Marvin in 2013. And that caused outrage back then. But then, I wonder, outside of racial justice circles, how long those events stayed in people's minds. And I think I thought about this long and hard, but my view on it is that I think the pandemic, to an extent, made people were forced to pay attention from the fact that we were all at home, but also perhaps the way social media has taken off really changed how people reacted. But ultimately, everyone, it felt like everyone paid much more attention. And what has happened since then is that I've seen large groups of allies emerging in anti-racist activism, lots of corporations making big pledges to address racism and representation. And I know I can show you my email inbox for how many more times people say, oh, you're a woman of colour, can you come and speak about XYZ issues? And I see this in Facebook groups all the time. So many of, in particular as well, Black activist colleagues and friends online who are, being inundated with requests to come and do labour, effectively, to come and do labour to address these issues. And it's obviously there are questions around, well, who are the experts who can actually speak to the lived experience, etc. But whatever way round it goes, there's still a huge shift that has happened in the past year. And what I have seen, particularly from kind of new allies, and I use allies in air quotes intentionally, is lots of well-intentioned but badly judged actions that just really sometimes demonstrate a lack of knowledge, awareness, and reflection. So people meaning well and thinking they're doing the right thing and wanting to make a change, but actually doing potentially more harm than good. And this is one such example. I'm sure most of you will remember last year, at some point in the summer, Blackout Tuesday, which actually stemmed from a couple of African-American musical industry professionals quite high up in the industry who had launched a campaign called The Show Must Be Paused, which was really about the entertainment industries taking stock. It was also about giving breathing space to, in particular, Black artists, people working in the entertainment industries, to not have to do to not be faced with normal life in the midst of a real crisis, really. But actually what happened was the whole world went, oh, we'll just post black squares everywhere, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram especially. And what happened through these, what I describe as performative actions, and it's not just me that describes them, performative activism, if you Google it, is a very, very interesting wormhole of pitfalls in activism. And it stems from things being trendy. People going, oh, well, I better post that black square. So the intention was, for there to be a moment of pause to reflect on what was happening, for people to educate themselves and to do that labour themselves, actually, and not rely on the labour of Black people. But the reality, of course, was that it went viral. and also the misuse of the hashtag. A simple little thing that actually, by jumping on a bandwagon and not taking time to do homework, people started posting black squares using Black Lives Matter. And that meant that for those who were out protesting, doing vital work to raise awareness and in need of things like advice, legal advice, what to do if you get arrested, etc., that all of those resources got lost in the search engine returns because of the sheer volume of posts. So what went wrong there? Whether it was done with good intention or just because it was trendy and everyone was doing it, the lack of attention paid to the research, paid to doing the research behind the campaign and to source the correct information, the correct hashtags, meant that ultimately those black squares did more harm than good. So what questions did this raise for me? One, where were all these people before? Where were these so-called allies before? Why did it take, and again, coming back to that question of what made 2020 different, what made the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd different? Why did it take until 2020 for people to start noticing? And this is, again, a sort of a line of dialogue that's come out a lot in online spaces I'm in. Anti-racism work has been happening for generations, particularly led by Black, Indigenous and people of colour. And we've often faced resistance for doing this work. So why are people all of a sudden paying attention now when we've been shouting about issues for years? But also, particularly thinking about performative activism, what are people's intentions? Are they acting out of a sense of pressure? If you don't post a black square, then you're racist? Or do they genuinely feel that they can see the problems and want to act? Do they feel obligated towards change, or do they actually feel that they want to make a change? But also that, as I'll go on to talk about, one or the other is no good, and is really doesn't make a difference. We need both, not either or. And ultimately, what happens if people haven't done their homework? So as I've said, what I've seen is a lot of so-called allyship appearing that just does not seem to have done any of the homework, that has ultimately erased historic anti-racism work that has been led from the people who experience it most. That is where the expertise is. That is where the lived experience of the issues are. And that it undoes or erases the fact that there was resistance to that work. So bringing this back round, I'm just going to check the time. Oh, we're good. Bringing this back round to my work and bringing it back to the questions I've been asking around my activism in music, thinking about community music, music education. So how do we navigate our sense of obligation? And how do we interrogate our motivations and our intentions? And really, for me, the most important one, what are the risks of both acting out of obligation and relying on good intentions? So motivation and intention being we do it because we want to, and obligation being that we do it because we have to. And, thinking off the top of my head of my 18-month-old niece, when she's told she has to do something, is she going to do it? Of course not. So it's a very kind of, I find those things very instinctive human nature characteristics. I saw a presentation recently that drew on this, ironically, big corporate EDI paper from Deloitte. And it talks about the transition point that I've circled here in red when creating change. And the idea that before that there comes a point where there has been a mandate, there has been an obligation, and that in order for the change to actually happen, there has to be a shift in how we think. And that is what can actually lead to effective change. And that's what takes us from tokenistic action to real change, integrated change. So what are the risks of relying on good intention? In coming back to my PhD interviews, these are 3 accounts from community musicians who went in with good intentions. It wasn't a disaster, thank heavens, but it so easily could have been because we were dealing with such huge amounts of people, and I guess there was an element of being naive. You're a bit like, hey, I'm 19, what could go wrong? I'm going in to, run some theatre workshops with a primary school class for them to help them learn yeah, I must have been fairly blasé about it. And it was definitely trial and error. I mean, obviously, I was completely winging it the whole way. So what happens when new graduates enter community music practice without a sense, one, of their own confidence, but also with a sort of, as these community musicians have put it, a sort of naivety, a sort of, oh, it'll be fine, or the good intention was there, but what is the risk there for the people they're working with if they can't follow that through with good practice? And thinking further about the motivations of what led people into this work. What motivates me, I think, just that feeling that, music can bring such joy, and that I just feel like, we are activists in a way, and we have the potential to bring about small changes in people's lives that somehow might make things feel better and more positive, more, what a gift to be able to work with music and the arts. And what's my motivation? Just that, I suppose. I really like, connecting people, feeling that sort of energy when you're working together on something, on an endeavour, and even, working with all my students, and then these groups of kids over a few months, and then just getting to that moment of performance when you see how far people have come and opened up during the process. Being able to use music to benefit other people, that's really where I'm at. That's my first passion. And so these reasons that, I know that when I had those conversations, did those interviews, a lot of this resonated with me, really, really resonated with me about what I first got out of community music, what I had, the satisfaction I got from doing youth work prior to that. And some of this, again, feeding into my current work as a teacher when I'm lecturing in higher education. All of this resonates with me, these things, when we see change in people, when we see them accomplish things, that adds to our motivation. And that leads me to navigating work that makes us feel good and how that feeds into our intention. We know our work in activism, in social justice work, in community music, in education. We know it can make us feel good. And we also know, as much as it's not necessarily why we're in it, but this is something that, again, we will all have people in our lives who go, oh, that's so great that you do that work. We know it makes us look good. And I think that's especially important in a world that is so visual and online, when we're constantly sharing what we do and whether we ask for it or not, getting gratified for it. But are we doing everything that we can to look after those we work with? And particularly, that's a question that comes up for me when I see new allies coming through. It makes them feel good to help. If they are able to post about it, it makes them look good. But are they actually doing good work? And are we having the critical inward conversations with ourselves about our intentions? Why are we here? Are we doing them? Does every action we take happen with the right motivation in mind? And actually taking a moment to think, are we doing this because we feel the need to act? Because we want to act? And what is the relationship between those two things? And so ultimately, why do we do what we do? And why does it matter? So I'll have someone pop these references in the chat, but that's really what I had to share. And I should also say, somewhere in lockdown brain, I managed to omit, so with this being PhD reading, of course, and a lot of these thoughts stemming from that, recently read wonderful book by Juliette Hess about social action through music education, and in particular, a great chapter on the dangers of activist music education. And that's where, it's been a really useful bit of reading to take these thoughts forward. So I'll pop, I'll look that out on the, I'll pop the citation for that in the chat during the breakouts. But really, that there are conversations happening beyond what I've shared that have really helped me kind of reconsider some of my PhD as well, which has been really helpful. But I will stop there so that we can get on with having discussions, because that's what I really want to do.
Diljeet, thank you so much. Ryan's giving a little round of applause there. That was just so clear, but so much in there, so many kind of questions and conundrums really for us to unpack together. So I know you were keen for us to have a lot of time in breakout discussions, and I know that you've set some questions and a Google Doc. Yeah, I agree, Kerry, very thought-provoking indeed. So I think we're going to have those. Thank you, Catherine. Catherine's just popped a link to the Google Doc in the chat. If you can access Google Docs whilst on this call, we invite you to open that, and when you go into your breakouts, we'd like you to kind of add to that document anything of significance, importance that came up in your group conversations, and we'll pick up on those when we meet together as a full group. If you can't access Google Docs, then pop significant parts of your chat in the chat. And did we have a few questions, I think, Diljeet? Yeah, they're there. So, and Diljeet, am I right in thinking that this is a free choice? So you and your group can freely choose to discuss either what is the role of education/training in addressing the question of good intentions. And Diljeet, I was just thinking we've got a number of educators in the call working in community music and participatory practice, so very relevant. Thank you. You might choose what are our obligations in community music, music education and society, what underpins our inclusive work, or what are the big questions on your mind about the ethics of inclusive practice. And we'd love to kind of document some of those questions that might be on your mind, so please do put those in the chat or the Google Doc. So what we'll do is we'll have about 20 minutes now for you to go into some small groups. These questions are also on the Google Doc, and there'll be a comfort break about 5 minutes at the end of your breakout, and we'll let you know when that's happening, and then we'll all come back into the main space for the last part of the session. Diljeet, have I missed anything there?
No, I don't think so. I think that's all good. And as I just popped in the chat there, I wanted to leave room in that for people to put forward questions, either to discuss amongst yourself, but also that maybe will form some of a discussion that we can have as a wider group after the comfort break. Because I love a good discussion, and I think I'm expecting, knowing who's in the room, I'm expecting some juicy questions to come out. So use that as a place to document, and then I can start thinking as well. Ahead of being posed with them. And also, I might add some space on that Google Doc as well, just for general personal reflections, if that's something that people would feel that they benefit from. It's just a bit of space to reflect on there. So I'll be on the Google Doc behind the scenes, interacting with you through the breakout sessions.
Great, so we're about to go into breakouts. Before we do, can I just check, are there any questions from people in the main room? Was that all okay? Good, Ryan, if you could open the breakouts then, please. Thank you. See you all soon.
I wonder, I just thought it sounded, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, Megan, but it sounded like you had something kind of that had emerged out of the first session. So if you wanted to kind of share your thoughts or reflections, and then maybe we could narrow it down to a question, but just kind of taking in some of the thoughts that are already existing.
Yeah. I guess my my big question right now is, how do I, as a white person in a space of leadership, start to move towards building like beloved community inclusive space, address address the idea of racial justice in a choral context, and whether that's like addressing it head on, or whether it's incorporating practices that are in just more inclusive in a way, or more, I don't know. I feel like there's a lot to know. I don't even know where to begin with my question. I guess a couple years ago, I had an experience with starting to awaken to some of the historical and the historical issues of colonialism, and just general barriers for people in our society currently, and then it's got me thinking about, okay, so what about choir? Like, how do I make choir a place of belonging, and I don't want to. I could ask my questions for hours, but I'll just leave it at that. I guess me as a white person, what's my responsibility in addressing?
I'd just be curious, like, what are the barriers then that you perceive, especially particularly kind of expressing it from what you call a white person's point of view? So, like, what are those barriers that you feel like you're encountering because it sounds like, at least from before, there was something that sparked, planted a seed that now you're kind of trying to dig into to understand better. And I think for me, that seems like one huge step for everyone. It's like kind of just becoming aware and making efforts to kind of get informed. But so, so I'm just curious, like, what are the barriers that you feel like you're encountering in this kind of movement?
I guess there's my fear of not wanting to say the wrong thing, and my fear of perpetuating harm in the choices that I make, whether it be from the repertoire that I choose, or inviting a guest to work with us because and having that appear tokenistic. I really want to approach music in an authentic way, and also have it be have there be the possibility for social change or transformation, and unlearning and learning. I feel like maybe in the past I've chosen music of, like, if we're just talking about musical choice in an ensemble, there have been maybe I've chosen music of other cultures, or cultures that are not predominantly Western anyways, just to have variety, right? And not maybe delved into that culture so much, or like deeply, or consulted anyone who might have expertise in that area of music on how to perform that. So just, there's so many different layers, but that's like one big question, because ensembles, at least our ensemble exists to provide an experience for community members where they can feel joy and meaning through their experience of learning and performing music for others. So how in my repertoire choices, how do I make that authentic and equitable and enjoyable? And just, I guess a barrier for me is not really necessarily having the tools yet to know how to approach or move forward.
Just to let you know, I put a document into the chat from a conference I was at, which was somebody had been working on this, and it's basically it's a Google Doc, what songs not to play anymore. I don't know if you've seen it going around, but it's very American, very North American. It was, but it's quite interesting because, and it's really geared towards big bands and chorals, like brass and such. But I don't know if you've seen it. It was at a conference and somebody shared it and said, spread the word. So I
Yeah.
pass it on. And it's quite interesting because you kind of go, oh, oops, oh, oops, oh, oops. Oh, Susanna, just a lot of the kind of Hal Leonard stuff. And I think there's a distinct difference between naivety and malicious intent. And I think that's, when we make mistakes as practitioners, it's almost always because we don't know different. It's rarely have I seen anybody do anything intentionally. And I had an experience of being asked to work with a group up here that is all Black and ethnic minority young people. That's their whole premise, is to like an inclusive space, etc. And to run a music workshop. And so I thought, okay, I'll bring my colleague, who we work as a team, 2 white people, and I'll bring some students who are doing community music or music of some sort, studying with me in the college. And then I had to think, well, the students that are super keen to do community-based work happen to be white in my class. I have a couple superb musicians that really don't want to do community work, but they will mirror the participants. So where's my responsibility? Where's my duty of care in this picture? There's like layers here. There's like, so for my participants to have somebody who mirrors them come and work with them is really important, right? But for me to do it as a tokenistic gesture, it's not right for my students who aren't really interested in doing it. So, and I don't want to take advantage of them or abuse. It was a really interesting situation. And in the end, it came down to availability, and we were all white. But it really made me think a lot about that thing of weighing up the rationale for the decisions we make, the kind of duty of care we have to, and like Robert and I, we're educating others in the craft, but we're also our own craft people. But when we're educating others, we have to have a duty of care to our students who might go out into the field, but also to the participants. But also, and it's actually a really, the points you're raising, I think a lot of us feel from different angles and perspectives. And I don't know what the answer is.
It kind of rings like what you're saying, Jess, what comes out, and I guess this comes out a lot, but it's that element of even when you're educating and creating context, just, we're going to make decisions that are always kind of, there's ambiguous layers in these decisions, but can we be reflexive and reflective enough to notice those ambiguities in itself and be that aware, because then our choices at least have come from that space of like awareness, and then we can go forward with whichever they end up. And I think going back to what Megan was saying about the repertoire, it poses a really interesting question, because how much thought also do we need to put into some of these decisions when they're coming from good intentions, which goes back to these initial questions. But can we just, if we have that level of reflexivity, can we then choose repertoire as it is, to celebrate music as it is? I just wonder that, because I do really value like diversifying repertoire in that movement to having varied voices. But should someone feel a barrier just because they're not from that culture? I don't know.
I agree with both your points, and thanks, Jess, for sharing that Google Docs. It's a good list to have. I'm looking for it and thinking, oh man, what am I going to do for Christmas without jingle bells? That's a nice one to do for beginners. But I think we all make mistakes, and I think that's fine if you end up, singing something, that's a little problematic. I think as long as you address it and open up the conversation at some point. I had a pal who was teaching Winterland, and there is a stanza that mentions Eskimos, and she's realized, oh no, I've taught my kids this. What am I going to do to stop making these kids racist? And there was hordes of comments saying, oh, it's just a word, it doesn't matter, or just change the words up. And then I got tagged in because, you know, white people want help from people of color. So what I suggested was, this is a good opportunity to open up a question of, oh, I'm so sorry I taught you this, but now I've realized after looking it up, it's problematic, and explain why it's problematic. You know, would this song be problematic without this verse? What makes this word problematic, and why are some words more problematic than others? What's the history behind it all? And I think often we forget that it's okay to make mistakes. You know, as a teacher, you can't be expected to know everything. There's a lot, and we've only had so much training in specific things. And even still, I mean, I don't know what your studies were like. I went to a music conservatoire. Almost everything that I did was just white and European. There was no music. And even being Chinese myself, I've assimilated into this whiteness, and I do find it difficult to even find repertoire that's beyond anything beyond Europe, actually. That's not problematic. So I think as long as you're making the efforts and opening discussions and conversations, I don't think you should give yourself such a hard time.
Yeah, and I think that's, for me, it all comes down to being an authentic practitioner. So, you know, in those moments where you go, you say to your group, wow, I just realized that is such a racist line. Well, you know, wait, can we change that? But actually just go on that journey with them instead of being kind of authoritarian in one's approach of deciding the music, or not bringing it to the table, but actually allowing it to come to the table and then using it for a really authentic dialogue, which is, I think, what both Preetha and Hannah both kind of alluded to, or Hannah definitely did, and I think you were saying the same thing, Preetha. So, yeah, I think that's really the most important thing in all of it. But
and it sounds like, Jess, what you're saying, it's like not fearing kind of going in that journey to open that conversation, to be so transparent that you can have that with the people you're working with, because actually that can grow you closer to, and almost make a more inclusive space, if there's space to do that, you know. That's really interesting.
Oh, I have like a gut instinct that's leaning towards question 2 in terms of obligations. I think there's a lot that, can't get my words out. There's a lot to explore here, because there are so many things that impact upon our obligations. So whether it's our relationship with the funders and the requirements of who's funding the project, can we fulfill the obligations that we'd like to have, or are we sort of fulfilling obligations that funders ask us to have? And it's quite interesting to explore that kind of relationship dynamic there, and how it might affect what we do and what we deliver.
I think that thing around the tensions, Hannah, in regards to navigating obligation, is such an important question to be able to ask ourselves as people who have power to do things in, you know, let's just say community music specifically, but we could extend that to the arts and cultural sector, I suppose, as well. In, you know, anywhere in the world where we've got a responsibility to resource and deliver music making. But yeah, it's how, like, because the thing that I was always interested in is historically it was kind of understood as this chameleonic practice, in that you do what you need to do and you kind of subvert the system so that the good work can happen, but it doesn't really change the kind of like the uneven frameworks that then reproduce the problems around access and inclusion and things like that, which make it hard when you've got obligations to funders. So I'm really interested in that. And I thought what Diljeet was talking about around, you know, the critical spaces for your own professional development and how that sits potentially in conflict with those obligations in a more formalized context? I think they're really big questions and important ones.
And I think that kind of builds towards as well the sense of personal obligation. So there's sort of like sector obligation, and then there's personal obligation, and there's that thing of, okay, when the funding comes to an end, and if you're not able to generate more funding, where is that sense of personal obligation to the communities with which we're working? And there's often a bit of a personal cost sometimes to community musicians, where people either start donating their time for free or try to find other ways to keep something going, but maybe at a very, very low cost, that kind of like diminishes the profession, if you like, the financial validity of the profession. And so I think, that kind of juxtaposition, or maybe not even juxtaposition, but that dichotomy of sector obligation and that sense of personal obligation as well to the people that we're working with.
I like that you mentioned personal obligation, and I'm thinking about our obligation to ourselves as well, and reaching a kind of clarity about what we mean by, good work and good intentions, and some of the internal searching, right, that happens to get that clarity.
Absolutely.
I wonder, I two questions come to my mind. One is, what's the role of evidence in this? Because we have an obligation to try and understand our practice better, and not just to rely on our assumptions about what our practice is about. And in that case, we surely have an obligation to try and seek evidence and investigate what we might be doing, really, in the same way. It's an extreme example, but in the same way that the doctor should seek evidence. We're not doctors. So that's one issue, and I have a critique of the sector, which is that it doesn't engage enough in evidence. Engages in discussions of value, but that's different. And my second question is, what about genre in this? For example, bearing in mind Black Lives Matter and all that's come out in the last kind of 6 to 12 months about music education and the dominance of the white racial frame. And do we have obligations in our music practices, our musicking, to debase the white racial frame, the kind of harmonic dominance? I come from a classical music background, which is why I think about this kind of thing. Or does it matter? Or is any music, and regardless of what you do, and you need to be authentic in your musical genre choices? And I have no idea what the answer is. I just know that these are questions we should discuss.
Yeah, I mean, a thought comes up that in education work, for example, or social work, it's very hard, I think, when I think about it, to disaggregate value from evidence, because values are kind of inextricably intertwined with identifying, goals and framing questions. If we can agree upon some educational goals, say, which is necessarily involves value, then we can think like more empirically, about the degree to which we've attained them or not, but it's the how those the value element or the normative element lives with the empirical element, right? And that bit of a dance. But I agree with you, Tim, that at least as I've looked at music education, like there can be an absence of evidence driven thinking, or even some resistance or allergy to research approaches that right, I see, that could be seen as like overly dry, or I don't know, it's a bit of an allergic response, quantitative or something.
I think there's lots of debate about methods.
Oh, yeah.
And quite rightly there should be. But I think there's not enough, my view within the sector, but people don't engage in those debates. Practitioners don't engage in those debates enough. Or even just about what the implications of those debates might be for what they do and where they do it. And it's how they talk about it. It's how they talk about the money that they get to the people who give them the money. But Ruth, presumably you've just done a doctorate looking at this kind of thing.
Yeah, I have. This is not unfamiliar territory, which is it's good. I was laughing at allergy to methods. I thought maybe that needs to be the title of a book or something. Yeah, I have a really strong view that evidence and value are interrelated but distinct, and one often drives the other. And I think when it comes back to that thing about what are the values that are driving our work, whatever that work is, whether it's in the methodological design of research or whether it's in the scaffolding that we set forth for people to access a music programme, I think the values that we work towards are understood through particular filters. So coming back to that idea about obligation, both to ourselves and the people that we work with, and then also the structures that we need to access to resource it. I think it's a really complicated picture, and I think, Tim, what you were saying around practitioners don't necessarily engage critically with these kind of questions about evidence. I don't think that the sector allows for that space. I don't think that kind of critique in professional development, and this is just my opinion, but what I looked at through my research was practitioners are not given the space to allow that kind of critique within professional development, and it very much becomes, so I looked at it from a sociological perspective, and I talk about it as playing the game of culture. So with good intentions, so I use some of the similar language that the Diljeet drew upon, and it's with good intentions we design these projects, but we work within a framework that doesn't necessarily enable us to maybe drive the kind of social justice aims that might be rooted in our passion and vision. And like Travis, like you said, the reason why we do the work that we do, but it's disjoint from that because of the way of resourcing it. But we have got a responsibility, I think, with what Diljeet was saying around ethics and activism, and thinking about the way in which people claim a space of allyship, particularly in the current moment. The cultural sector is not diverse. The cultural sector promotes and performs a value narrative of diversity, but it's not a realistic picture. The work, if I'm going to shut up now, but if MD is interested in it, Brooke, Taylor, and O'Brien recently produced a book, Culture is Bad for You, but it's a series of but a series of works over the last few years, and it's all about how the cultural sector is made up predominantly by white middle class people, and that reinforces a particular kind of meritocracy. So we can talk about value, and we can talk about ethics, and we can talk about good intentions and what it means. But if I quite like the diagram that Diljeet had around, the transitions of where you move from a good intention to an intended act of activism. I didn't know the model that well. Like, that's, the cultural sector has a responsibility to challenge it. So just now they don't have space to, but I think they should.
Right, I think we're all back in the space. So this is our time to open out to a group conversation. We'll pull at some of the threads from the Google Doc. Thank you so much for populating that, and feel free to keep adding things as we talk and adding to the chat. I think, Diljeet, I'll hand over to you because there were some things that I know grabbed your attention straight away. So do you want to pick up on some of those and open up to the group?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, just kind of thinking about some of the things that came through. I'm really keen to unpack conversations that were coming up about safe spaces, what's not a safe space, what is, what's unsafe. Someone posted what is and isn't okay to share I really want to hear more from whoever posted that about it, and a little bit of expansion on that. And what else stuck out to me?
Well, should we start with that one?
Let's start there. Yeah.
Yeah. So was that what can we or can't we share? How was it phrased?
Yeah. What is and isn't okay to share?
Hi. That was in Breakout Room with Alicia and Bex. And I can't, sorry, I didn't get your name. Lauren and myself. And it was more about, it came from a question that I've been kind of playing with for a while with the early, because I work in early years. And there had been some training that other early years practitioners that I know had been to about decolonising the early years curriculum and songs. And there'd been a question come up about, some of the repertoire that we use has been really massively popular that we should really no longer be using. And just how we share that information about why we shouldn't be using it when we're in the middle of an early years class being requested those songs. But then that also kind of relates to other sort of groups as well that you're working with. When you're in the middle of something, when is the right time to share that information? And, that sort of appropriate moment. I guess that's where it came from.
That's really interesting, Carol. Because I suppose the biggest part of that is the fact that it's with early years. And so there's how do you explain what can seem quite complex. But I did, so what I might do is I might have a wee look online, because I'm sure I've come across resources that kind of touch on that. Decolonising the music room is a good one, actually, in terms of conversations happening around navigating working with younger children. And I mean, I think something I've kind of learned or just observed, I guess, is that often things that we think are so complicated for kids are just, you say it, they pick it up, they go, okay, cool. And then they move on. Obviously that's maybe more, in terms of early years, you're talking really, really young ones. I think in terms of bringing in that context, obviously it's ideal, I think, to do it from the first interaction, but when you are, dealing with a situation, I guess it's explaining things through the frame that things change. Yeah. And that kind of, and also, I think something that can often happen in those environments is because you're working with a sort of a power dynamic in a way, they're like, oh, but why did we do it before? Mm-hmm. And I think that can often, bring us to confront things around, kind of what should we have done as the people in charge? Should we have known this earlier, etc. Or, and just in general, the being questioned by kids. And I think for me, there's definitely something that we can all be doing around opening up our vulnerabilities there. So, I mean, I do it when I'm in higher education, is just, tell me if I'm wrong, or being open to, just that general sense of things will change and that we are all learning. I think that's a big thing. That's something that Curriculum for Excellence, ironically, has really kind of helped me with, is the idea of lifelong, life-wide learning.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that, especially with younger kids, once they grasp that concept of everyone has the capacity to change what they do, change what they engage with, that's really where a lot of that can come from. But yeah, I think there's some great stuff popping up in the chat there. Thanks, Jess, for sharing those links. And yeah, as I say, it's funny, especially with this kind of thing, I always look to North America to see how the conversations are happening. So yeah, I hope that's something, but that was interesting in terms of how that, that context of that question is, because I would say in any other context, it's how we contextualize it, not when.
Yeah.
More than anything, there's not going to be a right time. So it's how we navigate that conversation.
Yeah.
And it is always going to be a bit awkward. I think there's something about coming to terms with it being that way.
And you're right, I mean, the children will be they'll just, okay, move on. Then they move on very quickly from a lot of things anyway. They just kind of keep going. I mean, it's sort of like, obviously this parents in the room, sort of this, there is that navigating these two quite distinct different approaches to how you are delivering a session and the information you're sharing with them. But I think that's also something that we kind of were chatting about within our group, our breakout room, about how, there is a constant learning process, as you were saying, that there is also the changes and how we're learning and how we're, sharing that information and the conversations around that. So, yeah, I think it's it's an ever fluctual thing to navigate around somehow, and that there are going to be times where you won't get it right. I think just naturally accepting that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a huge thing, is accepting that there's going to be mistakes along the way. That's I teach a course on genders in the creative and cultural industries, and it's with undergrads and some master's students. And week one, we say we're going to make mistakes. I'm going to make mistakes. They're all going to make mistakes. It's just going to happen, and that's part of doing any work. I think any EDI work comes with that territory, that you have to be willing to make the mistakes and take the learning that comes with it. Because if we're too scared to make the mistakes, we're not going to learn.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Diljeet.
Thank you, Diljeet. We had another question come up in the Google Doc. Somebody's asked, would the word responsibility be a more appropriate word? I don't know if you want to pick up on that one.
Yeah, I'm really keen to. I think it's really helpful as well to have that context. So who posted that in, and what was the conversation surrounding it?
Yeah, I was in a room with Lee and with Agata, and I can't remember everybody else. If you were in the room with me, put your hand up. So the word obligation, actually, we took quite a while within our discussion to go over our sort of thoughts on the word. We kept sort of I felt like we kind of kept coming back to every time, is that an obligation? Is that an obligation? Like each time we were raising points that we thought might be an obligation. So sort of questioning it. And so, yeah, so we kind of, I think at the start is when we discussed, is obligation, do we have obligation or do we have responsibility? And then it got, into, as Lee said, into the sort of semantics of it. But it was just an interesting point that we did keep coming back to.
Thanks, Laura. And I think that's interesting. I feel like responsibility, and as I because I've had this conversation, or it's a conversation that I kind of keep coming back to in different groups. And I think responsibility is the one I'm going to add in to that, I think, as I move forward, because I think especially in this context, to give you a bit of a context, I was actually saying to Joe in the break about where I came to obligation from. And that's actually from spending 18 months working in the museum sector. And so thinking about the wider societal stuff that's going on, and looking at how the world has reacted to Black Lives Matter and colonial history, is that I often see that come from a place of obligation. And by that, I mean an external pressure, as opposed to responsibility and intention being things that we feel and assign to ourselves, but that obligation comes from elsewhere. And I guess it's somewhat related to how we position ourselves in the world, I think, because I'm sure that most of us here, or all of us here, would position ourselves as being people who want to make change. And so it's about interrogating, so where does our understanding of the need for change come from? Is it from knowing that there are inherent problems and feeling an obligation to do something, versus kind of without knowing what's out there, just wanting to do things? So it's kind of, it sits at a different level, I guess, I think, for me, obligation. But I think, yeah, responsibility is a really important word as part of that, because I think that's how we take obligation and run with it. I don't know if that helps at all. We were also saying, Joe and I were saying, more questions than answers here, very much.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Diljeet. I'm quite curious about Lee Willingham's comment in the chat, question mark. Is that a question from you, Lee Willingham? Would you like to?
Sure. Thank you, Diljeet, for your presentation. I look at the participant list here, and there were 44, and with the exception of a handful, most of us are white. And our discussion, as well-intentioned as it is and as important as it is still through the lens of white privilege. We're looking at our worlds, our contexts, injustices through the culture that we bring to it. And in North America, somebody mentioned they look to North America. Don't look too hard to North America. But there are some serious conversations going on around colonialism and systemic racism within the music curriculum that we teach. And this is very difficult work, and it's very difficult for us, I think, in the dominant culture. We're still a culture of highly educated people that are making decisions for others in our institutions. It's very challenging to know what to do. My question to my group was, who is able to tell us when we're doing good work and when we're simply doing performative work? Who can be that person? And my only way to address that is simply this: we must have the people we're talking about at the table with us. Nothing about us without us is an Indigenous saying here in Canada. And they're not here today. I know there's some exceptions. And the building of relationships with the people who are in the margins and living under the radar in many ways is the most important thing we can do. Let's bring them together. Let's open up with relationships. Let's bring them to our classes, to our research. And I'll be quiet after this.
Thank you so much, Lee. Yeah, I feel like that just resonates with a lot of my general thoughts about the work I do and the spaces I go into, because you're right, it is largely, and when I spoke before about the labour that's done by Black, Indigenous and people of colour around this, and that fine line as well between us doing the work, but also who we're doing it with. Yeah, I will also say, when I talked about, interestingly, when it was me that said I turned to North America, but that's also thinking about people like Brandy Pace, Michelle McCauley, doing the work as Black and Indigenous music practitioners. And so I think there is a lot, and I think from a UK perspective, those are the voices that are visible, maybe more so than Black and Indigenous people of colour in the UK. And when I say Indigenous in the UK context, it's always, again, I'm always thinking about that from a sort of global perspective, is that there are people who identify as being Indigenous from the global south in the UK. Because of course then we get into the conversation about Indigenous whiteness, and yeah, let's not get into that. But yeah, no, I think that's, and that is something that I grapple with as well, not being Black and doing this work. There's a limit to what I can speak to. That, again, if we look around the room, yes, there are people of colour here, but what we are not seeing is kind of diversity within that to a huge extent. And so I think these are constant conversations to be happening. And I think if I can use, Lee, your sort of prompt and provocation to something that stuck out to me, and that I think is a really important question around intention and responsibility. There was something that popped into the Google Doc around how we make our choices of what we use musically. How do we bring in different cultural heritages and traditions in a way that is not appropriation, in a way that is reflective of who's in the room? How do we do those things responsibly? I think is a huge issue. And how do we, I think for me, that's where it's about decolonizing and not just about diversifying, because there is an active process there about providing the content. To me, one of the key steps of decolonizing is to acknowledge the colonial if we name it, we can then better understand what we're working with and work to then unpack and disrupt the colonial elements of it. That might mean the entire thing, but that is a huge, that to me is the responsible way to include music from other cultures. Talk about it in its fullest context, be specific about it. If we're talking about, I had a conversation about Real Britannia this week, still having that conversation, but it's about the context. It's about understanding it in its fullest context. It's about understanding and acknowledging the oppressions and traumas that are associated with things, as much as it's understanding what are the values that it upholds, and having those conversations. I feel like I've gone off on a slight tangent. Preeta, you've got your hand up.
Thanks so much, Diljeet. It's really nice to hear you speak and share these concepts with us and ideas. Yeah, what Lee said and what you've been talking about was really like striking, coming out to me at the end of our breakout session, but I didn't want to open up another can of worms for discussion, so I just kind of left it in my head. But just following up from what you were saying, something that came up in our breakout room was about, like, it kind of emerged at the end that, yeah, we are all grappling with these issues, especially I was thinking about, how different it may be when you're grappling with these issues from a white perspective, because you have good intentions, obviously, but, just the sheer color can be that barrier. But and this connects to Joe's work, and I'm sure many of the other practitioners' work, but like, how do we include the people we work with in those conversations and those decisions, so that even when we think, oh, we have this responsibility to bring in repertoire and diversify and, instead of putting the weight on the shoulders of the leader or the facilitator, is there space to actually make it where, what do our participants actually want as well? We're leading this choir, we're leading an ensemble, and if there's potential for those like reflective and reflexive conversations to be held together, can there actually be meaningful work that happens? So yeah, that's just a little food for thought that I know we're probably all thinking about in different ways, but just to add to that, build on that, what you said before.
Thank you, Preeta. Interestingly, so the museum's job I was doing was about youth work and bringing young people, creating space for a better relationship between young people and museums, but with the onus being on museums to make the change. And so for me, it strikes me, and again, thinking about what it has done for me is it's changed how I then think about doing all my other work. So I've, how am I making space for democracy effectively? Because that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about having everyone who's involved feed into the process. And so that's something I've kind of really picked up from the museums project, is about how that should just be embedded, that everything about my teaching should follow the same ethos. It should be students should be feeding into what we include in the classroom. And similarly with any group activity, is doing it in dialogue. And I think that's something that maybe we've kind of forgotten about a little bit. Sometimes I think we can get kind of if we're doing something and the people have changed, the people who are taking part haven't changed, we kind of maybe forget to do that constant check-in and just working at how we do that. Do we do it in the session? Do we do it outside of it? How do we create those democratic spaces? I think that's really important. And something that I think just generally in society, we should just be embedding more of, making more of those spaces, doing it in our everyday lives as well. I think that's just something that should become a natural way of how we work and how we live. So.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you so much. We're getting close to the end of our time together today, and I'm very sorry to say that, because it feels like the conversation is just really heating up. I can see that there's lots of other people that could contribute around this discussion on dialogue, on partnership working. For example, Amy Wilson's comment in the chat, you could see. Amy, I was going to invite you to talk a little bit about that if you would like to. There's also a mention about participatory governance on the Google Doc as well, and there's lots here to unpack just in this one element that's a response to your brilliant presentation, Diljeet. As we've got just a few more minutes though, I just want to either invite Amy Wilson to comment on the partnership discussion in the chat, maybe we'll go there, or if there's anybody else who has something that they really want to add before we begin to draw to a close.
I think, yeah, it was a bit of a conversation we were having in our breakout room, and I think Diljeet touched on it really nicely, that there's something about just like making sure you do your homework and making sure you're doing your practice in a way that just like respects everybody in the room. And just is like making plain all of those agendas that may be coming from the commissioner or from you as an artist or from the participant who's come through the door, and that it's just, I'm really fascinated by like the training questions and the support that's there for musicians like before and after sessions, because I think there's so much that's happening within that tiny interaction, within that really small moment, that the musician is having to like, wow, not only do I have to make sure all the guitars are in tune, I also have to like navigate the like racism inherent in this room, as well as like deal with the interaction between like the fact that someone from the school is observing me, and like there's so much going on that we, yeah, just to kind of uncover all of that and to make sure that we're aware of it as we're working and supporting. So I work for a music organization, but I'm not a musician, so my role is to be there and to help to unpack some of that stuff and to offer our trainees and our experienced musicians the space they need to understand what's going on, which is really, really complicated.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I feel like space is important. That's that's the word that sticks out for me, and I think I did see it elsewhere in the Google Doc, was that idea of how do we make space for things, how do we hold the right types of spaces, really, really important, and how do we know what that constitutes? How do we know that we've created an effective space for those things to happen?
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Diljeet. I think we're going to draw to a close very soon. So, Diljeet, is there anything you wanted to offer or say before I wrap us up? That might be a no, but if you'd like it.
Yeah, well, one thing I'm not going to attempt to do is kind of try and summarize my thoughts. Other than that, to say, as expected, I'm coming away from this with questions to be thinking about myself. And so I'm really, really grateful for everyone for popping, for sharing thoughts, for putting things into Google Doc, and just for I think for turning up as well, to what I kind of, not necessarily intentionally, but I know that some of these conversations that this brings up are quite hard, especially the personal ones. I do have one kind of parting thought, which I had thought about giving you space. And I'm just going to find it in my email, actually. Well, I don't know if you've got it handy, Joe, but the personal reflection question that I'm just going to find. Yeah, so just thinking about something as a space for private reflection as you go away today is just to think about your own motivations and intentions, and just doing a bit of a personal check-in, and just making time for yourself and doing that kind of bit of being kind and compassionate to work through that. So I just wanted to invite everyone to do that when they go away today. And yeah, thank you so much. I was actually just saying to Joe during the comfort break again as well about where I take the thoughts I'm having on this next, and I'd really love, and we'll be in touch perhaps about a way of being able to draw on the collective discussion as I kind of take this work forward, because this is a conversation I'm having I've been having many times over the past 6 months, and so I'm really keen to be able to take each iteration of the conversation I have forward with me, so that I'm not just having the same conversation over and over again. So again, we'll be in touch hopefully, or we'll find a way to kind of make sure that everyone is happy to be part of that process, and for that sort of sharing of ideas and ongoing thought. And I'm going to keep the Google Doc live, so again, do feel free to bookmark it, and every now and then I might pop things in, bits of reading, questions, that type of thing, because I think it's a really good ongoing process. But yeah, otherwise, just thank you all so much for being part of the conversation with me. I really, really appreciate it. And this was like my first time sharing PhD stuff. So I feel like I've just come out of the end of a really big cave.
I think we should all unmute and give Diljeet a massive round of applause, because fabulous session today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Diljeet. And I know there were many people that were unable to make today, but we will share this event as a recording on our ICCM YouTube channel, so you can revisit it. And yes, Diljeet, we have everybody's email addresses, and we'll send you one follow-up email with a way to keep the document, the conversation going, the livable document with Google Docs and other ideas that Diljeet is mentioning. Thank you so, so much. Final bit of signposting from me, unless there's anybody else from ICCM that has anything to say, is that our next event coming up is in 2 weeks today. That is an ICCM Conversations event on the 25th of March with Nicola Weidenbach and Amy Mallet, who are going to be talking about their Parkinson's opera project and about participatory approaches to research. You'll see a link to that to book your free place in the chat now. You'll also see a link coming up to the ICCM channel, so you can watch this event shortly and other events soon from the past. And we will have more activity after the Easter break that we have here in the UK, and we will share that with you soon. But I think that's enough from us for today. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for your conversations, your contributions and your questions. And we look forward to welcoming you to another event soon. Thank you, everybody. Okay, I'm going to close the call, but if you're a member of the ICCM team or Diljeet, please hang around. See you all next time. Bye, everyone. Thank you.